Tonight, new calls for more documents.
I think releasing the affidavit would help. At least that would confirm that there was justification for this raid.
The latest in the raid on Mar-A-Lago. Plus, terror groups claim victory. Americans among the wounded in an attack on Israel.
Whoever harms the citizens of Israel will have nowhere to run.
And whose land is it?
Say it loud, say it clear. We don't want no violence here.
A new documentary cuts straight to the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All this and more on Faith Nation.
A bipartisan request for more information after an unprecedented search of a former president's property. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Caitlin Burke. A new warning tonight from America's top law enforcement agencies. The FBI and Department of Homeland Security announcing an increase in online threats against both law enforcement and government officials. The spike comes after the FBI raid on former President Trump's Mar-A-Lago estate. Meanwhile, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are calling on intelligence officials to brief them on the national security implications of the documents seized. Democratic Senator Mark Warner and Republican Marco Rubio writing a joint letter to the Director of National Intelligence requesting all information regarding the search and the contents it yielded. Trump maintains he did nothing wrong, pointing a finger instead at the FBI and calling the investigation an abuse of power. Reporter Dale Hurd has the latest.
We've learned the FBI search warrant of Donald Trump's Florida home authorized confiscation of every record he ever saw, read, or created during his 4 years as commander-in-chief, right down to scribbles on a napkin. Democrats are asking for a damage assessment from the intelligence community on the 11 sets of classified documents recovered in the raid, including one marked SCI, a classification for some of the most sensitive national security information that is normally viewed in a highly secured location. A lawyer for Trump signed a statement in June after a visit from the FBI saying all classified documents at Mar-A-Lago had been turned over to federal investigators.
Some of those documents were marked top secret, sensitive compartmented information. That is among the highest designation in terms of the extremely grave damage to national security that could be done if it were disclosed.
The warrant also shows that agents were looking for evidence of 3 potential crimes, including obstruction of justice and violations of the Espionage Act. Violating the Espionage Act carries a sentence of 10 years in prison. Obstruction of justice as much as 20 years behind bars. The former president has not been charged, and he claims the files were declassified. Some Republicans are calling the investigation an abuse of power.
The FBI raid of President Trump is a complete abuse and overreach of its authority. This is the same agency leadership that protected Hillary Clinton, James Comey, and continues to protect Hunter Biden.
The Department of Justice also allegedly took materials that contained privileged attorney-client communications. GOP members are calling on the Justice Department to release more information on reasons for this search.
I think releasing the affidavit would help. At least that would confirm that there was justification for this raid.
Lawmakers from both parties are calling for calm after threats against law enforcement and after some armed Trump supporters protested outside a Phoenix FBI office. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Republican Liz Cheney faces a tough primary this week. The Congresswoman has been in the spotlight for her leadership role on the January 6th committee, and the public position she's taken against former President Trump could cost her back home in Wyoming. CBN News Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka joins us now. Matt, is it looking like Cheney will lose her seat?
Well, Caitlin, the polls certainly aren't looking good for Liz Cheney, although she does bring a lot of name recognition and family history into Tuesday's primary battle. In this case, that could possibly help her with an unlikely source of votes, Democrats.
And on January 6th, Donald Trump turned their love of country into a weapon against our capital and our Constitution.
Representative Liz Cheney has been front and center much of the summer. She's been vocal as one of two Republicans taking a lead role in key January 6th hearings and steadfast in her belief that Trump bears responsibility for the January 6 riots and should be disqualified from holding a political office ever again.
I will do everything I can to ensure that the former president never again gets anywhere near the Oval Office.
But the backlash over the criticism has put her re-election bid in jeopardy.
There is no rhino in America who has thrown in her lot with the radical left more than Liz Cheney. Terrible. She has gone crazy.
Trump's backing Cheney's main primary rival, attorney Harriet Hageman. Analysts see a huge uphill battle for Cheney.
Polls show she is behind, and I would not be surprised if she gets knocked out.
Cheney's keeping up the fight by bringing in her father, former Vice President Dick Cheney, for an attention-getting ad in the days leading up to her primary.
There has never been an individual who is a greater threat to our republic than Donald Trump. He tried to steal the last election using lies and violence to keep himself in power after the voters had rejected him. He is a coward.
Even if Cheney's message about rejecting Trump doesn't stir Wyoming Republicans, it's an unusual appeal to Democrats, who can cross over Tuesday given Wyoming's rule allowing a relatively easy party switch for voters.
And I'm a perfect example of how her behavior in Washington has helped her, because she is, without asking for my vote, has convinced me that she is, without question, the best candidate to continue her career as a House of Representatives member.
Analysts are skeptical that Democrats could make up the gap for Cheney, as a University of Wyoming poll from just last week has her trailing by just under 30 points. Caitlin?
Thanks, Matt. A major deadline looms tonight in the Iranian nuclear negotiations. Iran is pledging to provide an official yes or no to the European Union's final version of the deal, which many believe is the last hope of restoring any kind of agreement with Iran over its nuclear program. Washington is said to have agreed to the EU's text, but a main sticking point for Iran appears to be the International Atomic Energy Agency's investigation into its nuclear activity. Tehran wants that investigation to be closed for good. Here with us now is Behnam Ben-Talebou, Senior Fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Behnam, thanks for joining us tonight on Faith Nation. If Iran rejects the latest EU proposal, do you believe it will truly be the final end for a nuclear deal, or could we somehow remain in limbo?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you again. I think both sides, both Tehran and Washington, gain something a touch more nefarious, you could say, by keeping the fiction of nuclear diplomacy alive. I think ultimately keeping that fiction alive is detrimental for American national security and the American national interest, as well as the national security of America's partners and allies in the region who are really on the front lines of this broader conflict with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And Iran likes to keep the fiction going because it prevents Washington from fully pivoting to a plan B, fully pivoting to a pressure policy, as well as politically complicates any potential Israeli military action against its nuclear sites. So both sides see an incentive, at least within their own partisan domestic calculations in their respective capitals, to keep that fiction going. And if past this prologue, the Iranians are likely going to give an answer that is neither yes nor no, but both yes and no.
So it sounds like that's your best guess on how this will play out tonight with the deadline.
That's right. I mean, again, if past this prologue, there is entirely a non-zero chance that the Iranians would give a clear answer, meaning greater than 0 and probably less than 1, which we do have to keep our eyes on. If they say no formally, that means they really don't believe there's any pressure coming from the West. And if they say yes, that it means that they made a calculation that they will use the potential pathway to a deal to repair their economic armor. But right now, all else equal, looking at the past, they're likely to try to drag their feet, ask for clarifications, do things that we've seen them do in the various iterations of diplomacy in the past decade.
Iran is not only helping Russia in its war in Ukraine, but also benefiting from the rise in oil prices. Do you believe the way that the Eastern European conflict is playing out factors into Iran's decision regarding a nuclear deal?
Only partially. I would say a lot of the things that Iran saw with respect to the Ukraine crisis vindicated the worldview it already had. For instance, it already had a narrative about NATO that was much more in line with Russia's interpretation than America's interpretation. So it vindicated that ideological narrative. Also, the fact that Iran has been able to generate illicitly these oil export revenues at higher prices means that it has an easier time saying no to Washington and no to the EU in multiple iterations of nuclear diplomacy. So Washington really does need to pivot to pressure. It may be too little, too late already, but the Islamic Republic is riding this high, is riding this sense of vindication, and as you mentioned, is exporting oil at high rates.
How close do you believe Tehran is to a nuclear weapon at this point?
You know, the very scary thing, there's two different timelines. There's the breakout timeline and there's the weaponization timeline. While both these timelines are based on technical metrics, how these numbers come about are also politically derived. What I would point your audience to is the increasing comfortability with which former and current officials in Tehran talk about the fact that not producing a nuclear weapon is not out of a technical issue for them, it's simply out of a political issue, meaning that they could go all the way if they wanted to go all the way, which is a very dangerous position to be in because all the cards are in the hands of your adversary. And as we've seen in the past year and a half, Tehran has no compunction about being in the driver's seat of any crisis.
All right, Ben and Ben Talablu, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank
Elsewhere
you.
in the Middle East, at least 5 Americans are among the wounded after a terrorist attack in Israel over the weekend. The suspect opening fire near Jerusalem's Old City. While no Palestinian terror groups have taken responsibility for the attack, CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl tells us they are calling it a victory.
Terror groups welcomed the attack and called it an heroic operation.
Today, this operation confirms that the Palestinian people continue on the path of resistance, and all the tools of struggle and resistance against this occupation are to protect our people, our land, and our holy sites.
The attack occurred just outside Jerusalem's Old City walls, near a place called David's Tomb, where people pray. The terrorist opened fire on a crowded bus and those nearby, wounding 8, including a pregnant woman.
6 wounded arrived at the trauma unit at Shar Tzedek Medical Center. 2 wounded in serious condition, a pregnant woman in her 30s with a very complex abdominal injury, and a man in his 60s with an injury in the neck and head, also a gunshot wound.
All the wounded are recovering, including the woman and her baby, which had to be delivered by C-section. While Hamas praised the attack, the suspect, Amir Sidawi, a Jerusalem resident, is not a member of a terrorist organization. He does have a criminal background and turned himself into police hours after the shooting. The U.S. condemned the attack, and U.S. Ambassador to Israel Tom Nides tweeted, "Deeply saddened to confirm that Americans were injured in this attack. I've spoken with the families and will keep them in my prayers, continuing to monitor the situation." Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid said police will reinforce Jerusalem.
There is one conclusion from this event, as from previous events. Whoever harms the citizens of Israel will have nowhere to run. We will hunt them down and get them everywhere, and will deal with them with the full severity of the law.
He emphasized that Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, is what he called safe, open, strong, and welcoming to tourists and residents. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Coming up, the latest on a plot to assassinate former U.S. government officials and Iran's response to an attack on author Salman Rushdie. Award-winning author Salman Rushdie is recovering in the hospital after a knife attack Friday left him in critical condition. Family members call Rushdie's injuries life-changing, but they say the 75-year-old novelist is now off a ventilator and able to speak. Rushdie's 1988 novel, The Satanic Verses, set off a firestorm in the Islamic world, even prompting death threats from the Ayatollah. Authorities are still investigating Friday's assassination attempt, but the suspect is said to have expressed, quote, major indicators of support for Iran. Iran's state-sponsored media praised the attack, one paper calling it divine revenge. Meanwhile, the Justice Department officially charged an Iranian man with attempting to assassinate former U.S. government officials. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo were the targets of the murder-for-hire plot. George Thomas has the details.
In October 2021, Shahram Poursavi, a member of Iran's elite Revolutionary Guard, reportedly offered an FBI informant $300,000 to eliminate John Bolton, who had served as National Security Advisor to former President Donald Trump.
The facts we allege are clear and chilling.
According to the Department of Justice, the 45-year-old Iranian operative from Tehran had his agents conduct surveillance on Mr. Bolton's office and residence. Court documents say Poursavi didn't care how Bolton was killed, but that his group would need video proof of the target's death.
Through the hard work of the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Forces, we were able to detect this heinous plot and disrupt it.
Poursavi, who never visited the United States, reportedly offered the informant another $1 million if they would carry out an additional hit on another top Trump administration official. The Wall Street Journal says the intended target was former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
This is an especially appalling example of the government of Iran perpetrating egregious acts of transnational violence in violation of U.S. laws and our national sovereignty.
According to the DOJ, the alleged murder-for-hire plot was likely retaliation for the 2020 U.S. drone strike that killed the head of Iran's elite Quds force, General Qasem Soleimani.
We face a rising threat from authoritarian regimes who seek to reach beyond their own borders to commit acts of repression, including inside the United States.
I could say I'm not the only one that the Ayatollahs in Tehran are trying to assassinate. So this is the kind of government we have in Iran.
Bolton says the plot, which began a year after Soleimani's death, shows just how dangerous Iran is.
This is a murderous, lying regime. It's an enemy of the United States, and we need to treat it that way.
Poursavi, who remains at large abroad, is now wanted by the FBI on charges related to the transnational murder plot. If convicted, he faces up to 10 years in prison. George Thomas, CBN News.
Whose land is the Holy Land? A new documentary seeks to answer the question at the heart of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict when we come back. Egyptian Christians are grieving the deaths of at least 41 believers killed by a fire that broke out during Sunday morning Mass. By Sunday evening, thousands had gathered to mourn the victims. Witnesses say the blaze rapidly swept through the packed Coptic Orthodox Church in Cairo, black smoke filling the sanctuary. At least 15 children are among the dead. Authorities are still investigating the cause of the fire, but it's thought to have originated from an electrical generator used by the church. When it comes to the heart of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the question of whose land is it keeps coming up. One filmmaker is now seeking to prove Israel's legal claim to the land by taking a look back at history. Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem.
For many around the world, including the United Nations, Israel is an occupier on land stolen from Palestinians. They often chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
From the river to the sea means Haifa and Jaffa.
This is part of the strategy to delegitimize Israel. Not only is there a biblical mandate for the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, but there's a legal foundation as well.
Producer Hugh Kitson's new film, Whose Land, disputes the accusation Israel is illegitimate by stating a legal foundation established more than 100 years ago. At the 1920 San Remo Conference, the victors of World War I divided the Middle East. The result included a British mandate, reestablishing a homeland for the Jews. The preamble states, whereas recognition has thereby been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country.
I believe actually what happened at San Remo and in the mandate back in the early 1920s was God putting the title deed of the land of Israel to the Jewish people and enshrining it into national law.
Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, narrates the film.
You frequently get the narrative that Israel has no legitimacy, Israel is occupying territory. And this film shows that that's not the case. It shows that Israel's sovereign territory is legally its sovereign territory. And it is not illegally occupying anything. It is not, there are no illegal settlements. There is just a false narrative against the State of Israel based on falsehoods.
Camp adds many Jews and Christians need to know the true story of Israel's legal right to the land.
And I think this film plays a major role in educating people about the truth and about what the reality is compared to the narrative that is shoved down everyone's throat by the media, by some human rights groups, by the United Nations, by the EU and various other international bodies.
The film cites other experts, including international law professor Avi Bell.
Simply putting out the basic facts about what happened to whom when, why it is the Jewish people have legal and historical and moral rights to their homeland in Israel. It turns out this is of fundamental importance. It should be obvious, but it's not.
Many, including the Biden administration, continue to push a two-state solution as a resolution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The long history of Palestinians rejecting this proposal leads Kemp to believe it's not what they want. In the meantime, he says, the campaign to delegitimize Israel carries global implications.
Not only does it affect Israel, it kind of discredits Israel's reputation for those people who believe it, but it also fuels and incites Jew hate around the world. And we've seen examples of that in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and other European countries, all fueled by this anti-Israel narrative based on lies.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Coming up, America's team is off to the Little League World Series. We've got more on the team's historic win next. Finally tonight, it's a proud day on the South Shore of Long Island. Massapequa Coast, also known as America's team, is headed to the Little League World Series. The New York underdogs sealing their ticket in a 4-0 victory.
Joey Leonetti throws a no-hitter, and New York wins the inaugural Metro Region Championship.
The big win marks the first time Massapequa has reached the championship, and the Cyclones are the first Long Island team to reach the World Series since 1978. The Little League World Series kicks off on Wednesday, with the Long Island team taking the field Friday. Congratulations to the Cyclones. We hope you do great. That's going to do it for Faith Nation. We'll see you tomorrow.